Welcome to the future. PBS Digital.
All over America, battered mothers are losing custody of their children when they file for divorce.
I naively thought that, if somebody molests their kid, I thought they'd just go to jail.
Even with a proven record, abusers are winning joint and sole custody.
To win custody of the kids over and against the mother's will is the ultimate victory, short of killing the kids.
I was just snatched up from my normal life, and all that anyone would tell me was that my mom was crazy and that she was going into the mental hospital.
In a case where those children have been abused or the mom has been abused, what's really best for children is for their safety to be made the top priority and for their healing.
It was just so scary because I was like, let's run away, let's get out of here, Because, all this has happened. I mean, what kind of person would take you away from your mom?
A third of the women in the U.S. will be victims of domestic violence. It will have devastating effects on their children. The Mary Kay Ash Charitable Foundation is proud to underwrite this program.
Sometimes there's one child in a family, and then everybody kind of agrees to abuse that poor child. Well, that wasn't true with me. My older brother was once almost beaten to death by my father. My sister was abused to a lesser degree, but she was quite terrified of my father. And as both my brother and sister would have agreed, because I was the youngest and the last one, and he had become much more of a violent alcoholic, I received the most brutal, the worst treatment.
He would fly into his rages just for no reason at all and start just behaving like an animal. And so I used to wonder if I were doing something wrong to provoke him to do that. And it took me years and years and years to realize that there was really nothing that I could do.
The fear, the best description, the best two words probably are constant fear. That's the first thing. It's constant. It's always eating away at you. And another description I would say is another description of the intimidation I'd say is ruthlessness.
He was starting to reach in the drawer for the revolver. And I remember going toward my sister and grabbing the knife out of her hand and putting it on the table and saying, "There." And I must have been maybe, 11 years old at the time, 10, 11, 12, something like that. And then my dad, withdrew his hand from the drawer. So I know I've been asked quite often, have you ever called the police? Was the neighbors ever call the police? My dad was the police.
I had a pretty good life until I started, until my mom and my dad started to have arguments and over the whole custody thing.
We went to court for the first time December of '95. The attorney put a restraining order on him for his actions with the abuse. By January of '96, he told me that he was going to ruin me and destroy me. That's when he came back to tell me that he would be taking Sarah away from me.
When I was walking to school with one of my friends, and he came in his car and pulled over, and he tried to get me to talk to him, but I did, and he said, do you want to live with me? And I said, I don't know, but because I was afraid if I said no, then he would just keep asking questions, and whenever I saw him, he was always asked why was I shaking, because I started shaking in front of him, because it's just scary, and I don't know what he's gonna do.
The court said that my daughter spent too much time with me. They wanted Sarah to go into daycare because after school, they wanted to start getting her used to staying away from me.
It's very widespread, unfortunately, among abusers to use custody and visitation litigation as a continuing weapon of the abuse. And Custody and visitation litigation can make it impossible, in one sense, for a woman ever to escape the abuse.
To win custody of the kids over and against the mother's will is the ultimate victory, short of killing the kids. It's the best way to hurt her and kick her down is to get her kids.
They said that my daughter was afraid of her dad. She didn't want to visit with him alone, and that was my doing. He was pulling her out of cars to visit with him, even when she didn't want to leave. And they said that I wasn't pushing her out of the car. Basically, they said that I should just bodily take her out of the car and drive away. And at that point, they got it in motion to start this parental alienation syndrome that they charged me with.
Parental alienation syndrome is a theory that was invented by a man named Richard Gardner. He said there is a syndrome called parental alienation whereby the custodial parent, who is usually the mother, is trying to alienate the children from the father. And she's doing it by raising these false abuse allegations.
If you have a child who is reluctant or refuses to visit a parent, or who makes complaints that the other parent is abusing them and refuses to go to visitation, the cause of that is the mother doing things to sabotage the relationship with the father.
Gardner's research has been thoroughly debunked by the American Psychological Association, and every other credible scientific expert that has looked at his work has said that there's no scientific validity to it. But they have acknowledged that nonetheless the courts are interpreting the facts in front of them in this light. And so if a mother comes into custody court and says, the father battered me and is putting the children at risk, or has even abused the children, the immediate response is, she's alienating. This is called parental alienation, Your Honor. She's just trying to alienate the children from the father. This is what mothers do. What we know statistically is that several studies have found that 75% of contested custody cases, 75% of those cases have a history of domestic violence. What that tells you is, if you're a judge and you're sitting on a contested custody docket, don't be surprised when abuse is brought up.
There are dozens and dozens who will all agree with me that this junk science called parental alienation syndrome has been responsible for so much harm. And yet I am aware every day of judges basing decisions on this, and psychologists using this as knowledge and making recommendations to judges because of this junk science, and it is appalling and responsible for so much harm.
I received something in the mail. I did not have an attorney at the time, and the court-appointed attorney for my daughter said that it was just going to be changing the visitation sites. They ordered me to come into court, and that's when they had already made their decision to charge me with parental alienation. And they took her away that day, saying that I was not to go to her school, pick her up, that her dad would be picking her up. 2 days later is when he told her that she wouldn't be coming back to me.
I was in the van with him, and I remember, I'm like, can I go back to my mom? And because it was the day I was supposed to go back that day, and he's like, you're not going back. And I remember because we were going to Safeway, and I ran to the payphone and dialed on 911, and I said, help me. But I hung up, but I was too scared. I just wanted to run away. I remember kicking and screaming, and he's like, stop it. And he's really calm about it then. But I just couldn't get over the fact that I couldn't go back to my mom. And I tried calling her. I tried going back to the house. Yes, and I remember that I remember he let me go there just to say goodbye.
She knocked at the door, and she was just hysterical. And, asking me to run away with her.
She's like, we couldn't, and I felt really sick, and I had to use the bathroom, and I was all scared, and I just couldn't handle it. And I remember him coming up the stairs and knocking on the door and telling us to go, but it was just so scary because I'm like, let's run away, let's get out of here, because all this has happened. I mean, what kind of person would take you away from your mom?
When a woman goes to court seeking custody of her children and seeking to restrict the batterer's visitation with the children, she's not asking the court to protect her children. She is simply asking the court to permit her to protect her children. And what is happening is not that the court is failing to offer her protection. What is in fact happening is that the court is forbidding her to protect her children from a very well-known, very well-established danger. Parents have a right to protect their children from abuse by the other parent. Protective fathers have a right to protect their children from abuse by the other parent. But it happens for certain reasons of social conditioning that the person that children are needing to be protected from is more often a father than a mother.
We walk into these courts, we think that they're going to do right by us, and we lose our children. And this is the best kept dirty little secret of our family court system. So once you're defeated, it's almost like a process to get back on your feet. And if you look at it that way, you really have to take the emotion out of it. If you got the emotion in it, you're done. And then go through the process of how to rebuild it back to where it makes any type of sense. You have to get yourself up and then fight it, because it is a battle.
Cases where the mother alleges battering and risk to children, how many of those cases are being awarded custody to fathers? And what the studies are showing is roughly 2/3 award joint or sole custody to fathers who are accused or adjudicated of battering.
There is a societal misconception that mothers are very heavily favored in custody and visitation litigation over fathers, and that somehow will take care of the needs of mothers who need to protect their children from a battering or sexually abusive father. In fact, the maternal preference went out more than 20 years ago. And the research studies that we have had in most recent years not only show that the maternal preference has disappeared, but in fact that fathers now have preference for custody.
When we were a family, he picked on my mom, and now he has no one else but me, and he won't pick on his girlfriends. So, and I'm the only one that's there.
Well, our grandmother believed me, but, the rest of the world thought he was just this very respectable, perfect person who was this big lawyer, and he was in this club, and he went to church every week and everything, and to everybody else thought he was this perfect person with a perfect family that was really nice, and he was nice to his family and everything.
Much more often than not, an abuser is someone who comes off well when he's talking to people outside the family. He knows how to present himself as a calm, reasonable person. Often he's actually quite skilled at presenting himself as a victim of an unreasonable or vindictive or hysterical woman.
My ex-husband is extremely violent. When he becomes angry, he can't check his anger. You can see anger come over him physically. He becomes red. His entire demeanor changes. If you don't get away physically, you will be hit.
There would be no telling when he would just fly into a rage and start breaking things and hitting people.
Yeah.
So we had to be very, very quiet and stay out of his way, do whatever he said, and try to, live on the fringes without provoking him too much.
If he found out that the kids or I had any enthusiasm or excitement about participating in anything, or that we might be having friends or any kind of normal life, he would take steps to cut that off.
One of the things that was my dad's favorite to do was to kill the pets or hurt the pets or threaten to kill the pets. He did that a lot. I remember one day coming home from school, and I went upstairs, and there was a rabbit, one of our rabbits, Tibber, lying on the floor, and I went over to him, and his neck was broken, And I don't really think rabbits could break their necks all by themselves.
I met him at a party, and it turned out that we had all the same friends. I really thought he was fine, and I married him 6 months after that, and had Catherine 9 months later, and had to leave when she was 10 months old because, you know, he was even hurting the baby. So we were separated for 2 years, and during that time, he was attempting to get custody of Catherine, the baby that he hated. And he told me that I would have to come back or, you know, she would be hurt. So we remarried. When people ask me about that now, they think that that sounds absolutely insane. Why would you remarry someone who is a dangerous person and has threatened to kill you and harmed your baby and everything else? But if you were in the situation, you would understand that that was the safest choice that I could make.
Once I got the strength to stop the battery, then it stopped. But it seems like they take their victim into court, and the battery actually amplifies.
The custody battle started where custody slowly got changed to where there was set times when we had to see our dad.
I had custody for about 5 years. In the process, in those 5 years, we went through 2 to 3 full psychological evaluations.
In family court, the judge will appoint a custody evaluator, a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a social worker, to conduct an investigation to make recommendations to the court.
None of the tests have been validated for use in the domestic violence context. Oftentimes, batterers test very normal. In fact, most of the time, batterers test normal. The tests actually tend to make the victim look pathological, a little bit off balance, because the tests do not assess for battering.
More and more time was given to my dad, even though me and my brother were against everything about that. We wrote letters, talked to our attorneys.
The idea is that children cannot speak for themselves in court, and that you need an adult who essentially is representing the child or the child's best interests to the court. Because again, the idea is that neither parent is speaking for the children, they're speaking for themselves. Each state has its own laws about who can be appointed. In my state, you have to be a lawyer, but in some states you don't. And the idea is that they're appointed to represent the child, but there's a lot of confusion and ambiguity in, I think, most states about what that really means. In some states, that means that they speak for the child, and they're actually a voice for the child. In more often, I think that's perceived as speaking for what the guardian themselves thinks is the child's best interests.
The child's lawyer has been documented by a number of people who've studied this issue to be perhaps the greatest impediment to a child being protected in the system, because they don't act like lawyers. They don't talk to the kids, they don't find out the facts, they don't investigate, they just go off and write a report to the court based on some misguided principles.
My own attorney yelled at me. He yelled at me and called me a liar, saying, when I finally think of something that is truthful and not what my mother's telling me, to call him.
There's ex parte hearings. I had 60 of them in my case, where you had a 24-hour notice to answer the documents that you had gotten served 12 or 14 hours before.
Ex parte means on behalf of one party. In a court proceeding, the judge, in order for the judge to be fair and impartial, is prohibited by judicial ethics from accepting information or contacts from just one side.
You can informally call the judge's chambers if you're just trying to find out if they're going to issue a ruling on something that you've already filed, or when are they going to do that, or can we postpone the next hearing, that kind of thing. But what is not considered appropriate is to go before a judge and allege new material and raise new legal issues and new factual issues without notifying the other side.
Now, for some reason, the system, although it's not by anybody saying this is how it should happen, The system in family court in these cases that we're talking about are very frequently the product of ex parte communications.
I had no problem with visitation with my ex, but every time they went for visitation for 2 weeks, there was always an ex parte, which extended the visitation to 3 to 4 months. And then when my sons came back, unfortunately, then the mother gets the brunt of not protecting them, and you get hammered pretty heavily back by your children.
You don't know what you're supposed to counter because you don't know what the judge heard or what the judge believes before you get to court. At least if things are presented in open court, you can respond. So this ex parte communication that occurs in family court in these cases is devastating.
I was very fortunate that the week before my children were taken away from me, that I had an advocate approach me. And to be truthful, I thought she was playing crazy because I still hadn't understood the whole picture of what was going on. And she flat told me, she goes, they're going to take your children away. They're going to do it in the most harmful way. They're going to mock you in court. And they're going to do everything they can to make you come unglued. And I looked at the psychiatrist and I said, you know, I just was courteous to her because she was giving me free time. But to this day, I thank the Lord for her talking to me because exactly what she told me was going to happen happened in court that day. An ex parte hearing, my boys were crying and hanging on to me, being told and torn off of me, and said they were going to have to live in Indiana because their mother was alienating them from their father.
I was really touched by all this wonderful, all of you wonderful ladies, but again, we are all in the same boat here. And I just want to say, I know it's very hard for all of us, but first of all, we have to deal with how am I going to translate my emotional status. I mean, here you're going to talk about emotions, your child, how are you going to translate this, what all these emotions you have? And then we all have our cultural backgrounds. So are you going to be screaming? Are you going to be standing? How is that going to be looked at? Like earlier it was said, you know, men can't just be mad and, you know, people will attend to that. Oh, he's upset. Well, women, when we go and express our anger, we're crazy. We're all the other names. I can't even think of it myself. He told me once, he made me and he will unmake me. And this is what's going on with him, that he has this belief, this poor African woman that he brought her, got education and is doing so well, academically and professionally and financially and relationship-wise, that it's to him, it's not possible. And he always feels he has to unmake me. To a certain extent, yeah, taking my child away from me for this period of time was, and will unmake any woman.
My father has a way of making important people in custody believing him that he is a good father, that he has never done anything wrong, and that my mom is crazy and abusive. He cries during the hearing, and if you ever see a 6'3" white grown man cry in front of you, you think, what a horrible teenager he must have, you know, that poor, poor guy. And he plays it to the full extent. He's manipulative and he knows what he's doing. He's been doing it for 15 years.
We've been in legal custody since she was 5 months old. My mother once told me, you know, when I was so tired and I wanted to give up, she says, remember chickens. You go after the chickens' babies, the little chicks. The mother chicken will come after you and just literally attack you. And she said, you're stronger than a chicken.
My father would check me over every time I walked into his house from my mother's, if there's any mark on my body, and he'd go to the courthouse and he'd document that as abuse. One time when I was 3 or 4, my mom was ironing clothes and I stepped on an iron and it burned my ankle. He said my mother was deliberately burning me. I was taken away from my mother and I was sent to live with my father without any contact from my mom for 3 years. During those years, my dad used to slander my mother frequently, telling me she was a drug abuser, you know. She ran off to Africa with a new husband and she has a new family now and she doesn't want to come back. You know, she's a whore, she doesn't want me anymore, she abandoned me, and, you know, she abused me so much that she, you know, that if I ever saw her, she'd kill me. what he was doing to my mother and me was beyond my comprehension at the time, so I thought he was this great guy. And I had never even fathomed that he would lie to me. So part of me, really knew it wasn't true, and she was my mom and she's never done this. And then the other part of me is like, well, this is my dad. He would never lie to me.
Since we have research showing that children's relationship with their mother is the #1 factor in how resilient they're going to be to the experiences of having witnessed domestic violence, we know that the long-term harm to children from having a father damaging, destroying their relationship with their mother is potentially huge.
At the end of the 3 years, I went through a therapist who suggested that I go start reunification with my mother. At first, I was really adamant. I did not want to do it. I was like, she's forgotten about me all these 3 years. She didn't want me. She ran off. And I just, spilling out everything my dad had been, brainwashing me for the past 3 years. But then after I met her and through months and months of visitation, finally I realized she's not the person he's painted her to be. He must be lying, and I put 2 and 2 together.
He was just this wonderful attorney there, not a father, no emotions. And sees some objects that he has to get back that was taken from him.
I then requested to, maybe at the end of 8th grade year, because, I'd be going on to high school, I would move with her. Ever since then, he started becoming, more hostile, more, I don't know, more resentful of me.
The first time she was 13, she was put in a foster home by her dad, voluntary basis. How many teenagers would want to say, the first time I ever turned my teenage year, I was put in foster home?
After 10 months, he didn't enjoy the financial burden it had to keep me in voluntary foster care, so we struck a deal. He said, you come stay the last 2 months of 8th grade with me, and then I'll let you go live with your mom. So the day before I'm supposed to go with my mom and I'm packing, my dad tells me, oh, change of plans. You're not going home. He's like, you know what? You treat my wife, you treat me, and I don't like you because you're so I'm not going to allow you to go back home.
Emotional abuse is the systematic diminishment of a child. It is never an event. It is a pattern of behavior. It is a sequence of events. Again, it's never a single event. And it has a goal. Its goal is to diminish the self-concept of the child, that the child feels unworthy of friendship, unworthy of respect, unworthy of a child's birthright, and that is to be protected, to be loved. The child is made to feel responsible for the abuse.
The one thing I think that stayed with me as a child and through most of my adult life was the fact that I never talked about it, never shared it, and I think it added to a lot of my problems. Shyness, very low self-esteem, a lot of times feeling whatever was going wrong was my fault. All these things, I realized later on, were all related to the fact that I was harboring all these emotions that I never allowed anybody to share with me.
I know that there are organizations who are out there and advocates who are supporting each other. I'm more action-oriented, and I can't settle down, and it's the only way I think that I can even find healing, even though you can't be healed until you're on the other side of the fence. It's a way of keeping me going, is doing something. And,
Mothers are never prepared for their children to disclose sexual abuse. And when my children disclosed, I didn't want to believe it, but I didn't know what to do either. And I was in the midst of a divorce, and the children had only that 1 week begun to see their father alone when we had separated, and that's when they came home, and one of them was in serious pain, and she was quite inflamed in her vaginal area. And so when you start going through the battles, it's number one, you don't know what to do. I turned to my attorney and I was given very, very bad advice. I turned to the courts through my attorney, and I found that the more my children disclosed, the more the court didn't want to believe that my children had been abused. They believed their father instead, and they took the children away from me totally. It's been 4 years and 3 months since I've even seen my children.
There is always the dilemma as to whether this is child abuse is an actual event as being reported by the mother. So on the one hand, if the mother allows it, they'll say, well, she is a neglectful mother and take the child away because you neglected to protect. And on the other hand, all too often, the mother says, especially after a divorce, a separation or a divorce, where the mother is now able to see things that she didn't realize that were going on, like child sexual abuse, on behalf of the perpetrated by the ex-husband. Now she's able to see these symptoms.
Well, clearly my daughter has been abused, and it's all documented, and she wrote a lot of letters to the judge by herself and tell the abuse, and the judge, actually that made the judge very upset, and the judge thought that my daughter directly challenged him. So he not only gave the sole custody to my ex-husband, also put me back to supervised visitation 4 hours every other, once a month. And after that, I just collapsed, and I just couldn't hold together, even though I know I have all the truth, and but just too overwhelmed.
My sister has been extremely, extremely heartbroken over this matter. The fact that she's been taken away from her family. She's always been there to see the conflict between my parents. She's always been there to see the abuse that my father has really subjected his family to. So she's always been there first-handedly seeing what's going on. It's tragic, I'd say, that she is forced to go live with the same person she suffered at the hands of.
I told my daughter that she was gonna stay with Dad and only come back in a weekend to see Mom and her brother, and she was just devastated. And she also, at that point, reviewed to her therapist that her father molested her for probably 4 or 5 years. He'd been tug her every night, and she said that's one thing that happened for all these years. So I called CPS, and the therapist of my daughter called CPS. I filed a report to the police department. Then we filed a reconsideration with this new evidence.
That if he is in fact molesting her, and she's having all this upset, and she's pulling out of her eyebrows, and she doesn't know what to do because she's lived with him in the past and has seen his violence, that when he tells her he's going to be getting custody of her, she finally reveals what he has been doing to her. And the response to that is for her to be given to him and completely separated from her mother, completely. Birthday, Christmas, no contact whatsoever, to be isolated from her brother. And his motivation is clear. He has got to keep her quiet. And that's what this is all about.
There is no change of circumstances presented in the current motion. In effect, this is a second bite of the apple.
Commissioner basically said the sexual abuse allegation is suspicious because the time-wise, and why didn't the child review this before?
The motion is denied.
There are quite a number of cases in which a battering man also sexually abuses children. There's a high overlap between domestic violence perpetration and incest perpetration, statistically speaking. And I've seen the anguish of mothers whose children are being sexually abused and where the court refused to permit her to protect her children.
My daughter called me the first night after she went to her father's house. She talked to me 5 times on her cellular phone.
Nadia, sweetie, give me some time, okay? Give me some time. I need some time to have a look. Today, Nadia, today, okay? Are they threatening you on anything? No. Okay, Nadia, hang on there. Hang on there, okay, Nadia? Let me work on it, okay? What? I can't hear you. Talk a little louder. You don't care you gotta bring your where? I don't care. I just okay, Tanya, just listen. Hang on there now. Don't go anywhere, okay? Hang on there, sweetie. Give me some time to work it, okay? Get me out. I love you, sweetie. I'm working you out there. Okay, Manya, hang on there. You're fine, Manya. You know what, Manya? I know you're not fine. But, Manya, deep breath.
Young people that we have here who have lived exposed to the behavior of batterers, who know firsthand what happens to children from having a batterer present in the home. Go ahead.
My name is Jeff Hoverson. I'm with the Courageous Kids Network. It's part of the California Protective Parents Association. And I know many of you are in this battle. Many of you maybe might be therapists or whatever. But your kids, if they need somebody to talk to, I know when we were going through this, before we were all rescued, we were able to talk to each other, and it was the most helpful thing to know that another kid was going through the same thing.
The room I slept in was directly across from my sister's, and he would go in there and spend, like, I don't know, well into the night. I was young, but I had a concept of time, and I knew it was at least like 3 hours that he would be in there. And I couldn't imagine what else he'd be doing other than what I had heard from the interviews, because my sisters had said, you know, that's exactly when it happened. And I was so young, there's nothing I was going to do. I was so afraid to walk into the other room and see that he was, you know, touching them and stuff. It's the most helpless feeling.
About a year, maybe a year and a half after we split up in 1993, my oldest daughter, who was about 5 then, started acting out sexually on her younger sister. And that went on for quite a while. And, you know, I didn't know what was going on, but something didn't seem right. And so eventually, my oldest daughter started actually disclosing things like that her father was getting in the shower with her and sleeping with her, and she didn't want him to, but she couldn't make him stop. First of all, when my daughters disclosed that their father was molesting them, my oldest daughter, who was 7 at the time, described him showing her child pornography and forcing her to reenact what was in the pictures. She described being raped, sodomized, and she described him kneeling over her head, and she said, it felt like something pokey in my throat. So I knew she was telling the truth, because no 7-year-old child could possibly conceive of that position and could not possibly conceive of what that would feel like. When she had a sexual assault examination at UC Davis Medical Center, it was determined that she had 3 old healed wounds and 1 fresh wound and a damaged hymen. So my ex was not indicted. I mean, he wasn't prosecuted for the molest, and everything got dealt with in family court. Cut out of their lives.
It began with the evaluator, who made a report that said that my sisters were lying about my dad molesting them, and it was because of parent alienation syndrome. And so he wrote the report to the court, and they believed it because he was hired by them. And then it kept going with the lawyer who, in court, withheld all the evidence of molest.
You know, I naively thought that, you know, if somebody molests their kid, I thought they'd just go to jail. That was my impression. So I was so taken off guard by what was going on. It was like being in the twilight zone.
Mothers who allege abuse are automatically up against this defense that actually they're alienators. Then what happens is when the evaluator is brought in, or the guardian ad litem, everyone is busy investigating her for alienating. And they're looking at everything she does or says and casting it in this light of she's an alienator, she's trying to alienate the kids. And they're totally distracted from assessing whether the father is actually a risk and abuser to the children and the mother.
The court-appointed psychologist who testified to this parent alienation syndrome had never read the medical reports. He never read the police reports. He never even interviewed my children about abuse.
When an advocate raises child sexual abuse as a claim or a concern, it tends to enrage courts and evaluators and neutrals. It's the equivalent of throwing a bombshell into the courtroom. That's how it's received. It's seen as outrageous and extreme, and you're going to have to meet an extremely high burden of proof to persuade the court that it's true.
It seems to me that the whole system couldn't have cared less about my kids. They were focusing not on my kids, they were focusing on me. I became this target, and my kids' interests were completely, you know, thrown to the side after that.
I was, I think, 7.5 or 8. I was put in the custody of my dad. I was just snatched up from my normal life and put into an alternate one. I didn't get to talk to my mom. I didn't get to go back home and get any of my stuff. And all that anyone would tell me was that my mom was crazy and that she was going into the mental hospital. We didn't see our mom for probably 2 or 3 months, I think it was. And then with the therapist, we went into a room with my mom there, and walking into that room and seeing her there was the most awkward experience I've ever had in my life, because the therapist had told us not to hug her or kiss her or talk to her about what was going on in her life, so that didn't leave very many options for what to say or do. So walking in there, seeing her and seeing her so upset, and just being so upset myself that, you know, she was so close yet so far.
And what happens, moms? You have support that you don't even know of. You have government agencies, you have senators, you have state reps. And if you go to them and you take your stories and you document your stories and you go to them, you will find people that will help you. You gotta support each other, you gotta document your stories and help each other. And it's a battle every day. And don't take no. No is not no. No is on. Go again.
This evaluator that was at the bottom of all this, I filed a complaint against him with the Medical Board of California. He was actually charged by the state attorney general with gross negligence for refusing to investigate the sexual abuse and for giving incompetent testimony to the court, and he pled no contest to the charges. I filed a complaint against the judge, and after a 3.5-year investigation, the State Commission on Judicial Performance substantiated his misconduct in the case, and he was disciplined. The State Victims' Compensation and Government Claims Board did a new investigation, came back and said there was at least a preponderance of evidence that my daughters were molested by their father. And so basically, I've won the case on the state level, unfortunately, and new laws were created as a direct result of my case and 2 other cases just like it. And I even had the lawyer from the Assembly Judiciary Committee come to court in 2000 and say, we used the facts of this case to create this law. And the court said, oh, well, since the law doesn't say it's retroactive, we're just going to say that it doesn't apply.
It's
It's nothing we can do. The judicial committee is all hang up. It's all hold up by the power of the court system. How many complaints against these judges? Boxes and boxes and letters from all women. And then I found out that one judge who is sitting on my custody has 3 boxes of complaints against him.
We need to create meaningful systems of judicial accountability. That's a complex question. But judges who deal with family law proceedings generally have no accountability for their actions. There are very few battered mothers who are in a position to appeal. In some cases where they can appeal, we actually get very good responses from appeals courts. That's one of the bright spots in some cases.
The costs of litigating a case like this are staggering, because if you are a battered mother and you lose at the trial level and you want to appeal, the cost of appeals are huge. Typically, $50,000 is low to pay for an appeal.
We may need to look to jury trial for custody or some other way of making custody not up to just the particular opinion of a judge.
This whole area of abuse, both adult abuse and particularly child abuse, is very fraught. It's excruciatingly painful material, and it's something that no one wants to believe. And people who work in the field struggle with burnout and what we call secondary traumatic stress, which is what happens when you are exposed to traumatic material over and over and over, and you get either numbed by it or overly reactive to it. You can't cope well with it because it's traumatizing to hear about it. So I think some of what goes on in the courts is they're hearing about it every day, and they're doing what they can to cope with that. And some of the rulings that they issue and the reactions that they have to the parties are their ways of coping. They're not good for the kids, in my view, and they're not constructive, but it's their attempt to cope with the intolerableness of this material.
We have a belief as a society that when divorces happen, what's best for children is to have the most extensive possible relationship post-separation with both their mother and their father. And that's true in a typical divorce. That's not true in a divorce with a man that's a batterer or who's a sexual abuser. In a case where those children have been abused or the mom has been abused, what's really best for children is for their safety to be made the top priority and for their healing to be made the top priority.
I think I'd given up. I'd thrown in the towel. All I could do was send him miscellaneous emails that I loved him. I exhausted $98,000 of every drop of money my brother, my sister, my mother, and anything that we had into lawyers to protect them. The next thing I know is a year had gone by, and I think I went into more of a vegetated state. Go to work, come home, go to work.
I was out in California on a vacation, and I knew that this was now or never, because no one was going to help me. Only I could help myself. I was leaving my grandparents' house, saying that I was going to return a video game that I borrowed of my friends. From there, I went over to another friend's house and stayed there for a while. I went from friends to friends, just as everybody could handle me, staying sometimes a few days, sometimes a few weeks, to avoid being found.
I actually didn't want to think about my sons. It was too hard. It'd pull you down to a point you couldn't get up the next morning. I said, you know, I have to get up, I have to go to work, because someday my sons are going to come home. And that's when I received a letter in the mailbox. It was from Randall. He had made a decision of his own to run away. But my first expression was, oh, my Lord, he's run away, he's out on the streets. But in this letter, he stated that he was with a very good Christian family, and he was safe.
After about a year and a half, my court-appointed attorney was assigned as a judge to family court. With this, I saw an opening, and I started looking for my own attorney. After a little while, I finally found a good attorney that I thought I could trust, And that was just the best thing that ever could happen for me.
You all of a sudden knew it was going to come out on the other side. That he had an attorney that would talk to him and believe him. And that she actually said those magical words, your son's going to come home.
Finally found a really good attorney, and that was the most amazing thing when I called her up and she said, what do you want? First thing she said, what do you want? Not, I think this is what's good for you. I was like, I was stunned. I didn't know what to say. I was like, okay, this is not normal. So I told her, this is what I want, and you can tell him I will not come out of hiding until these things are done. And it was amazing how fast that she got things done. She was up there, up at the court, filing stuff in the judge's face, saying, this kid is not coming home until this happens. And finally, they caved.
We need to drop the best interests of the child standard for custody determinations. It's not a good standard because you can hardly ever find two people in the country who will agree about what the best interests of the child are. So the use of the best interests of the child standard is actually turning family law proceedings over to prejudice.
I always, when I was a juvenile court judge, I would have the child in chambers. I would have the lawyers there, of course, lawyers from each side, and I would question the child and let the child express their wishes. It should be taken into the total situation.
Year before I turned 18, I just decided to leave my dad's house because nobody would listen to me. My lawyer, who was the same one I'd had all along, would not listen to me.
I had been trying to get Jeff some counseling for his depression as a result of the years of emotional abuse and neglect in his dad's house. And I fought in the courts to try to get him some counseling, and his dad, because his dad had legal custody, he refused. He fought against it, and he basically has always been given anything he ever wants in the courts. So Jeff wasn't able to get counseling, so after he came to live with me as soon as he was 18, and his dad didn't have any control over him anymore, legal control, then I helped him to get into some counseling. And my daughters are still living with their dad.
They can't tell the truth even. They have to pretend like everything's okay. I mean, I see them, they visit every other weekend, and my relationship with them is, I can't say I have a relationship with them, but now I'm still in the battle, only for my sisters. I know they don't appreciate what I'm doing. They are not happy with me being here right now. But someday they'll understand that this is the only way they can leave.
Sarah has been court-ordered to return to her dad. She has decided not to do that. She's staying at an undisclosed place. She is going to her high school. Her dad has spoken to the principal, and the principal has decided to protect Sarah against him, seeing his outbursts and rages in the principal's office, and she's not allowed to live with me.
I don't think he loves me. I don't think my dad loves me. I don't think he loves me because he wouldn't have done all like this and try to like bribe me with money. Money is not a good way of showing love. He's never considered of taking me out or anywhere except on vacation with one of his girlfriends. He's always talked about money and about how bad my mom is. That's not how a father should talk about a mother when a child is there, and talk about how she's done all this bad stuff to him and how he's been the perfect dad. And I mean, how can you be perfect when you hurt someone so bad? It's like ruins you and it makes you feel like you want to die.
I think that your children are your greatest allies. If you talk to them and you reach out to them, they'll be more than willing to fight for you. I don't have to be connected to my mother. I don't have to talk to my mother, but I know as long as she's alive and there's a breath in her body, she'll be fighting for me, and I want to reciprocate that for her. And I think that if you get your children involved, it'll be a lot easier for both of you because you'll have each other for support and you'll have each other as allies in a fight to get something you both want.
If you or someone you know needs help, call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-SAFE, 1-800-799-7233.